The clink of silverware stopped mid-air. We were packed around my aunt's dining table. Holiday candles, too, loud laughter, the usual family chaos. When my dad leaned back in his chair, looked straight at me, and smirked like he'd been waiting all night for an opening. "So," he said, loud enough to cut through every conversation, "still doing that little, whatever it is you do." A few people chuckled nervously. My stomach tightened because I knew what was coming. I'd heard this tone my whole life, the one that meant he was about to turn me into a lesson. I tried to answer calmly. "Yeah, it's going well." That's when he waved his hand like he was brushing dust off the air. "Please," he scoffed. "You're uneducated and worthless. You always have been. You just don't want to admit it." Silence. Not uncomfortable silence, stunned silence. My cousin's fork hovered over her plate. My mom stared at her napkin like it could save her. Even my dad's friends, who usually laughed at his jokes, suddenly couldn't find their faces. And I felt that familiar heat of shame rise. Then, for the first time, something else rose with it: clarity. Because he had no idea who he was talking to, and I let him keep thinking that. I didn't correct him in the moment. On purpose. Because the truth would hit harder with witnesses. To understand why that sentence didn't just hurt. It detonated everything. You have to know what he'd been doing for years. In my dad's world, there was a simple equation he lived by: degree equals value, a master's, respect, a doctor or lawyer, bragging rights. A job title he could repeat at church or at a barbecue. Proof he'd done his job as a father. He collected other people's accomplishments like trophies. At every family gathering, he'd run through the list: my cousin the nurse, my brother the engineer, the neighbor's kid who just got into med school. He'd say their titles slowly, savoring them, and then he'd look at me like I was the part of the story that ruined the ending. I didn't take the traditional route. I didn't finish college the way he wanted. Life got complicated, money got tight, and I chose a path that made sense for me. I built something on my own skills, clients, a small business that started online and grew quietly because I kept my head down and worked. To my dad, that translated to one word: embarrassing. He called it not a real job. He called it lazy. He told people I was between things, like I was stuck in a permanent waiting room of life. The irony was, my worthless path was the only reason my bills were paid on time. But Dad didn't want facts. He wanted control, and he used shame to keep it. I tried every version of proving myself, and none of it mattered. For a long time, I thought if I just did enough, he'd finally look at me the way he looked at everyone else. So I kept trying. When I landed my first big client, I called him because I was proud. He barely listened. Then he said, "That's nice, but it's not stable. Call me when you have benefits." When I hit my first six-figure year. Something I never thought I'd do without a degree. I made the mistake of mentioning it at dinner. He shrugged and said, "Anyone can get lucky for a year. Let's see what happens when the economy changes." When my husband and I signed our lease on a bigger place so the kids would have room, my mom smiled, and my dad immediately asked, "So it's still not a house, right?" Like the only thing that counted was something he could brag about. It was always like that. Every time I reached the goal, he moved it. When you get a real job-ish, when you finish school, when you buy a house-ish, when you stop doing that internet thing. And the worst part was how everyone treated it like weather. My mom would whisper, "Just ignore him." My aunt would say, "Hey means well." Someone would inevitably shrug and add, "That's just how he is." But how he is taught me something: my wins weren't safe around him. If I shared them, he'd shrink them. If I celebrated, he'd punish me for it. So I stopped telling him the truth about my life. I'd answer questions with vague little half-sentences. I'd change the subject. I'd let him assume I was struggling, because it was easier than listening to him explain why my success didn't count. And that decision set up the twist later. Then came the day he decided to humiliate me in front of people who actually mattered. That night wasn't some offhand comment that slipped out. He's built toward it. It was my aunt's holiday dinner, but my dad treated it like a stage. He waited until everyone had a drink, until the room was warm and loud, until people were relaxed enough to laugh at something they shouldn't. He steered the conversation exactly where he wanted it. "So," he said, leaning forward like a talk show host, "what's everyone doing these days?" He went around the table, letting each person announce their title. Nurse, accountant, project manager, grad school, promotions. He nodded approvingly, smiling like he'd personally signed their paychecks. Then he turned to me, eyes bright. "And you?" he asked, too casually. "Still doing that little thing on your computer?" I felt my cheeks heat. "It's not really a little thing, but yeah, I'm working." He chuckled like I'd proven his point. "Working," he repeated, drawing the word out. Then he glanced around the table, actually checking who was watching, before delivering the line again with a laugh, like it was a punchline. "Uneducated and worthless." And people did that awful thing where they smile because they don't know what else to do. A few looked down at their plates. Someone cleared their throat. My mom's eyes darted to me, then away. But the part that made my stomach drop wasn't even the insult. It was what he said right after. "You know," he added, "I saw your page. All those posts. The little motivational quotes. You really think that's a career?" My blood went cold, because I hadn't told him about that page. Not once. I hadn't even used my real name on it. So he had been watching, and he'd saved it for this moment. When he had an audience. I didn't explode. I did something that scared even me. I stayed calm. My dad was waiting for the usual reaction. He wanted me to argue so he could call me sensitive. He wanted me to cry so he could call me weak. He wanted me to storm out so he could tell everyone I was unstable. Instead, I took a slow breath and nodded like he'd just told me the weather. "Okay," I said. His smile faltered. "Okay," he repeated, louder, like volume could force emotion out of me. I picked up my glass and took a sip. Noted. Around the table, you could feel people shifting. My cousin blinked at me like she didn't recognize me. My mom looked almost afraid, like she knew the script had changed, and she didn't know what came next. My dad leaned forward, voice rising. "So you admit it. You admit you're doing nothing with your life." I shrugged once. "If that's what you think." That calm, real calm, not the fake polite kind, hit him like a wall. He couldn't climb it. He couldn't poke holes in it. And it made him angry. He started listing all the ways he thought I'd failed. Louder, faster, crueler. I waited until he ran out of steam, then pushed my chair back carefully. "I'm going to check on something," I said evenly. "Excuse me." As I walked down the hallway, my heart was pounding, but my face stayed still. In the bathroom mirror, I stared at myself and realized something that felt almost illegal. I didn't need his permission to be proud of my life, and I wasn't going to hand him the truth in a way he could twist. I had a reason I'd kept my real life hidden, and now I had a plan. That night, I made one phone call that changed the entire family's understanding of me. Back in my car, hands still shaking on the steering wheel, I opened my phone and pulled up the one folder I never shared with anyone in my family. Not because I was ashamed, because I knew exactly how my dad would treat it. Inside were screenshots of invoices paid in full, emails from clients thanking me for saving their projects, a certificate from a local business group that had featured my work, a copy of my business registration, tax documents that proved, in numbers my dad respected, that I wasn't between things. I'd built something real. Not overnight, not by luck. By staying up late, learning what I didn't know, failing, fixing it, and trying again. I didn't have a fancy title to announce at a dinner table, but I had something: better results. And I'd kept it quiet because every time I gave my dad a piece of my life, he used it like a weapon. If I told him I was doing well, he'd call it a fluke. If I told him I had plans, he'd find a way to poke holes in them. So I stopped giving him ammunition. What he didn't know, what nobody at that table knew, was that my work wasn't some cute side hustle. It was the reason a lot of people's businesses ran smoothly. It was the reason certain campaigns didn't crash and burn. It was the reason clients kept coming back and referring me. And then there was the bigger secret. My dad had been connected to my success this whole time, without realizing it. He'd benefited from me. Directly. And he'd been mocking me with a full stomach and a clean conscience. I stared at my phone and felt a cold kind of clarity settle in. Because the truth wasn't just, "I'm doing fine." It was who I was in a room he respected. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of what he said. I'd heard worse. It was because something finally clicked. My dad wasn't worshipping degrees because he loved learning. He worshipped them because he was scared. When I was a kid, he'd tell stories about growing up with nothing, how his shoes had holes, how teachers talked down to him, how his own father used to sneer, "You'll never be anything," whenever my dad brought home less than perfect grades. He'd clawed his way into respectable circles, and he treated that respect like a fragile glass he had to hold with both hands at all times. Now I could see it clearly. My dad needed my life to fit his script, because if I didn't follow the traditional path, he didn't just see me as a risk. He saw himself as a failure. What would people think if his kid didn't have a degree? What would his friends say if I couldn't be introduced with a title? How would he prove he'd made it if I didn't look the part? So he tried to bully me into becoming his proof. And when that didn't work, he did the next best thing. He tried to make me small enough that my difference wouldn't threaten his image. That's why he humiliated me in public. It wasn't discipline. It wasn't motivation. It was self-defense. Once I saw the fear underneath it, I knew exactly how the truth would land, and I also knew I was done carrying it for him. So I set up a moment where he couldn't interrupt, couldn't dismiss, and couldn't rewrite the story. A week later, I sent my dad a simple text. "Hey, can you come with me to an event on Friday night? It's important." I didn't add emojis. I didn't explain. I didn't beg. He replied 10 minutes later like he was doing me a favor. "What kind of event?" I chose my words carefully. "A local business awards dinner. My client invited me. There'll be a lot of people there." That was all it took. My dad loved rooms like that. Rooms with name tags and handshakes, and people who pretended not to care what you did while silently ranking you anyway. Fine, he'd texted back. "Wear something appropriate." I could almost hear his tone through the screen. The part he didn't know was that I wasn't just attending. I was on the program. In the days leading up to it, I called the event coordinator, someone I'd worked with professionally for months. I didn't ask for anything flashy. I asked for accuracy. "When you introduce me," I said, "who's my full name and my business name, and please read it exactly as written." She laughed. "Of course. You're the keynote sponsor. We know who you are. Keynote sponsor." Friday night, my dad walked into the venue in his blazer like he belonged there more than anyone. He shook hands a little too hard, he smiled a little too wide, and he smiled at the wrong people, because the first person he tried to impress, the man by the stage with the event badge, turned out to be one of my longest-running clients. The man looked past my dad and said warmly, "There you are, we've been waiting." My dad's smile tightened. "Oh, you know her?" Before I could answer, he leaned toward me and muttered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Try not to embarrass me in there." Then he added with a little laugh, like the insult was harmless now, "Uneducated and worthless, remember?" I looked at him, calm as ever. "Just wait," I said. And then the name was announced, the lights dimmed and the chatter softened into a polite hush. A host stepped up to the microphone and smiled like he'd practiced it in the mirror. "All right, everyone," he said. "Next we want to recognize a sponsor who didn't just donate money. This person donated time, strategy, and expertise that kept multiple small businesses afloat this year." My dad straightened in his chair like the praise was aimed at him by accident. The host glanced down at his card. "Please join me in thanking the founder of Northbridge Media and Consulting, the creator behind the Small Business Systems program, and tonight's keynote sponsor." I felt my dad lean toward me, expecting to hear someone else's name, a doctor, a CEO, someone with a title he could respect without effort. The host looked up and said clearly, "Hi, your full name." For a second, my dad didn't move at all. His face froze in a half-smile that no longer fit. Then his eyes flicked to me fast, like he thought he'd misheard. I stood and walked toward the stage, heels clicking on the floor so loud in the quiet room it felt unreal. As I passed the table, a woman I recognized from a recent project reached out and squeezed my hand. "Couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. I stepped onto the stage, accepted the plaque, and turned toward the audience. The applause wasn't polite. It was real. I scanned the room and saw my dad sitting stiffly, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. Confusion had shifted into denial, like if he refused to believe it, it couldn't be true. The host kept going, smiling. "And just to add, Northbridge has helped over 40 local businesses streamline operations and grow revenue this year. If you've used the vendor portal or the scheduling system at the chamber. You've seen her work. My dad's eyes widened slightly at that. He knew that portal. He'd bragged about it once. How professional it was. How the chamber was finally doing things right. He'd been complimenting my work for months without realizing it. When I returned to the table, people were standing to shake my hand. My client introduced me like I was the most obvious person in the world. "This is the person I told you about," he said to the man with the badge. "Best decision our company ever made." My dad finally found his voice, but it came out tight. "Well, I mean," he forced a laugh. "I guess all my pushing paid off, huh?" The man with the badge frowned. Pushing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. "I wasn't hiding because I was ashamed," I said, looking directly at my dad. "I was hiding because you taught me it wasn't safe." My dad's face did something I'll never forget. Panic, then anger, then the realization that everyone around us had just heard the truth. I thought the reveal would be the hard part. I was wrong. He waited until the crowd thinned and people were back to talking in clusters. Then he grabbed my elbow, light enough to look casual, tight enough that I felt the message. "Can we talk?" he hissed, smiling at a nearby couple like everything was fine. I followed him a few steps away, near the hallway to the restrooms. The second we were out of earshot, his mask slipped. "Why would you do that?" he snapped. "Do what?" I asked, genuinely calm. "Embarrass me," he said, like that was the crime. "In front of those people." I stared at him. "Dad, you called me uneducated and worthless in front of family." Repeatedly. "You did that." He scoffed, then pivoted fast, like he was flipping through channels until he found one that worked. All right. Maybe I went too far. But look at you now." He nodded toward the ballroom. "It worked. I motivated you." There it was, the same rewriting, the same need to turn my pain into his success story. "I motivated myself," I said. He leaned closer, voice dropping. "Listen, let's just move past it. Family shouldn't air things out like that." "I didn't air anything out," I replied. "You did. I just didn't lie to cover it." His eyes narrowed. "So what, you're going to hold a grudge? Over a few comments?" Then his tone softened into something almost friendly. "Actually, since you're in with all these business people." He glanced back toward the room. "You could introduce me. Maybe get me a consulting connection. Or," he hesitated like he was doing math, "maybe you could help your mother and me with some things. We've got expenses coming up." I let the silence hang between us. Then he said the one sentence that proved he still didn't get it. "Just remember who made you." I felt something in me go perfectly still. Not anger, clarity. This wasn't about my feelings. This was about ownership, and he was trying to reclaim me. So I made the boundary crystal clear, in a way he couldn't misunderstand. I didn't argue with him. I didn't list receipts. I didn't give a speech he could twist into disrespect. I just looked at him and said, slowly, "You don't get to speak to me like that anymore." He blinked like he hadn't heard me correctly. "Excuse me." "No more insults," I said. "Not in public, not in private, no more worthless. No more jokes that are really just humiliation. And no more moving the goalposts every time I accomplish something." His face hardened. "So you're giving me rules now?" "I'm giving you boundaries," I replied. "Because I'm an adult and this is my life." He started to cut in, and I lifted a hand, not aggressively, just enough to stop the momentum. "If you want a relationship with me," I continued, "it's going to require basic respect. A real apology, and changed behavior. Not a performance, not 'I was motivating you,' not 'you're too sensitive.'" He scoffed, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. How far could he push? What could he get away with? Could he still control the story? I didn't give him room to negotiate. "And the business world," I added, keeping my voice level. "That's separate. You don't get access to my clients, my contacts, or my money because you suddenly recognize my worth. If you couldn't see it when you thought I was nobody, you don't get to claim it now." For the first time, he didn't have a comeback that landed. He just stood there, jaw tight, because he could feel the truth. The old dynamic wasn't working anymore. When I walked back into the room, people met my eyes differently. Not with pity, more like respect. My clients kept talking to me. My husband squeezed my hand. My aunt mouthed, "I'm proud of you." And for the first time in my life, I believed it mattered more than my dad's approval. The next family gathering tested everything. When the next gathering came, everyone watched him, waiting to see which version of him would show up. The next family gathering was a month later. Another dinner, another table, the same roles everyone was used to playing. My dad showed up quieter than usual. He wasn't suddenly warm, he wasn't magically proud. But he also didn't take shots at me like he used to. He watched me more than he spoke, like he was trying to figure out where the line was now, and whether I meant it. He still hasn't given me the perfect apology, not the kind you see in movies where someone breaks down and admits everything. What I got was smaller and more real, fewer insults, fewer performances, less control. And when he slips, I don't argue, I step back every time, because what changed wasn't just him, it was me. For years, I chased approval like it was a certificate that would finally make me enough. But worth isn't something your parents grant you. It isn't stamped onto you by a degree, a title, or a man who needs you to fit his image. Worth shows up in your actions, in what you build, in how you treat people when you have power, and when you don't. And if someone only respects you once they can brag about you, protect your inner life from them. Don't hand them your joy just so they can weaponize it. If you think he apologized right away, you'll want part two. So tell me, would you have revealed the truth the way I did in public? Or would you have kept distance and stayed quiet? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, like and subscribe.